MAGA versus tech bros and the future of American technology policy. To discuss the Christmas Day MAGA civil war and what it means for the future of immigration and AI policy, I have on Divyansh Kaushik of Beacon Global Strategies, formerly of the Federation for American Scientists, and himself a computer science PhD. Divyansh, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Good to be here, Jordan.
As a Jew, my Christmas days are relatively relaxed. I did check Twitter that morning and was unable to log off. So how did this all start?
A couple days before Christmas, the president had made some announcements about his tech policy staff. Some really good people, really smart people who were announced to be taking certain positions in the administration. And I think one of them was Sriram Krishnan from Andreessen Horowitz as White House Special Advisor on AI policy. I think that's what kickstarted this whole debate where somebody looked at Sriram's previous tweets about and found a lot of his views on immigration policy. And then they made a whole thing about why is President Trump nominating somebody who favors more legal immigration?
Obviously, the fact that Sriram is Indian American had more than something to do with it. There was like an undertone of racism in a lot of these tweets. Maybe not even undertone. But what I think was most remarkable was the sort of loud push that you got from the tech bro side of things. Yeah. So for more context, Sriram hosts an adorable podcast with his wife and is very much a sort of agreeable, personable, respectful, lovely human being. From my, dozens of hours of listening to him talk to, founders and whatnot about technology. And by no means brought this upon himself. But it was sort of like a muckraking thing that dug up and sort of bubbled up in the ether. And what was sort of so remarkable was, the backlash that just appointing an Indian American would create, as well as the lengths to which the sort of tech bro VC Silicon Valley contingent of the Trump support on the internet ended up, started screaming very loudly. We had Elon, I think, topped it off with this line: "The reason I'm in America, along with so many critical people who built SpaceX, Tesla, and hundreds of other companies that made America strong, is because of H-1B. Take a step back and fuck yourself in the face. I will go to war on this issue, the likes of which you could not possibly comprehend." There's always a question, Divyansh, given the sort of Trump coalition had a lot of unlikely bedfellows in it, at what point some of these fissures would show up in the open. And it was pretty striking to me that it was, 3 weeks before the inauguration, and you already see, these barbs being thrown left and right on a central policy issue.
No, that's right. And I think, Elon himself being a previous H-1B holder, and Sriram coming to the U.S. as an international student at one point, they have this really unique experience of having gone through the process themselves, which is really critical to understand how bad the system is. It's not just that the system needs reform, it's that the system needs to be rebuilt altogether. But the whole point of this debate was it really raised the salience of this issue. Why do we have an H-1B program? Why do we have other visa categories? What has Congress done and what it hasn't done? And I think that's a debate that we haven't had in a long, long time, unfortunately. Because if you talk to people in Congress, or even if you look at what President Trump talked about in his first term, in his in a speech he gave in the Rose Garden, where he was talking about making sure that all this top talent stays in the U.S., there's a general recognition that this is where we want to be, that this is what we want to do. And there's not a policy disagreement essentially on this. In fact, if you look at, the last time Congress tried to do something on legal immigration alone, almost passed. The House passed an amendment on their version of Chips and Science with green cards for STEM PhDs. The Senate almost passed that, except for objection from one senator. There was not really any objection out there. And because of the way the Senate operates, and one senator can really hold up a lot of things, especially if you're the ranking member on the committee of jurisdiction, in this case, the Judiciary Committee, then, you have a lot of power. But like overall, if you look at it, the general trend is everybody agrees that the system is not working in the way that we would like it to work, that it is still a net positive. You look at H-1B in particular, for instance, as an example, you've got median H-1B holder makes more money than a native-born American employee in the same positions, even if adjusted for age and education, experience, whatnot. You still get that the median H-1B employee makes more. Yes, there are a lot of abuses by the ID consulting firms and all that the debate also brought up, and those issues need to be fixed. But it's good that we are having this debate.
So, that's an interesting contention. Like, there's a other side of the argument that salience on issues can be counterproductive, particularly when polling around them isn't all that positive. There may be an elite consensus that high-skilled immigration and sort of more visas for people with undergraduate or graduate degrees is a positive thing. Polling around immigration in general is not necessarily in favor of more foreigners coming into the U.S. So therefore, if you can just whisper into Trump's ear to do this and not have like the whole world think that Trump is, pro-immigration, then that may be an easier thing for him and Republicans in Congress to swallow. Like, what's wrong with that argumentation?
I would say that when you talk to an average person on the street and ask them what do they think about immigration, they don't talk about the doctors and PhDs and engineers coming in. They talk about the southern border, because that's what's occupying the whole media landscape, the mind of every person, and that's where the salience is really high. People are not really talking about legal, skilled, high-tech immigration, where the salience is not really that high, because that's not what Congress is talking about. That's not where people's attention is. And I think this conversation raised the salience for that particular issue, reminded people that immigration is not just people crossing across the southern border. It's not just chaos. It's the doctors in those rural districts who are foreign-born and foreign-educated, who are serving those states and rural areas because we have a doctor shortage, or the entrepreneurs like Arvind Srinivas, who founded Perplexity AI, or Elon Musk, or Sriram Krishna, right? That these people came in through legal means as like graduate students or entrepreneurs or like to work here, and then they really changed the game completely. And I think when you look at polling as well, like there was this Echelon Insights poll of Trump voters, people who voted for Trump in 2024, 71% of them strongly or somewhat supported more high-skilled immigration. 71%. Whereas 23% of them were strongly or somewhat opposed. And that's not like too far away from the Biden voters. So this is a niche area of immigration policy where you find like common ground across the aisle. And I think that's something that Congress should capitalize on as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And I think also, like, given that nothing happened in Trump number 1 and nothing happened in Trump number 2, there's not necessarily a huge, like, downside in trying another strategy. And I think, like, I mean, what is the downside? Something viral goes like, oh my God, 01, what is this? This is like some secret way to like bring in foreigners or whatever. And then it gets shut down. But like, look, like the fact that you haven't had real immigration reform in decades upon decades now just means that it's worth throwing different playbooks at the problem. I have a very sort of tangentious analogy that I just want to share because I thought it was interesting. So I've been reading a lot of Civil War history, and Lincoln, and I think there are, weirdly enough, some aspects that echo between Lincoln's decision to publish the Emancipation Proclamation and skilled immigration today. So during the first few years of the Civil War, right, there were a lot of Union a lot of Democrats in the North, McClellan, and sort of like, Union sentiment in general was much more in favor of fighting to preserve the Union than it was to free the slaves. And there were many arguments that, blacks would come to the North and depress salaries and whatnot that are sort of roughly aligned with what the more MAGA parts of the internet are talking about when it comes to skilled immigration. And Lincoln did this incredible two-step right before writing the Emancipation Proclamation, writes a letter that he gets published in the Washington National Intelligencer, where he sort of reframes why it is he's doing, he's going to be freeing the slaves in the first place. He says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I could do it. If I could do it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." And so basically, like, a lot of historians sort of look at that passage and sort of read that back into Lincoln's intent that, like, oh no, he actually didn't care about black people and freeing the slaves, which, like, not true. But the sort of political gamesmanship in there of, like, allowing a different frame of this saving the Union or whatever it is, competing with China or creating jobs, to be the thing that is what you lead with when it comes to immigration, as opposed to arguments that have been failing for decades and decades about, being fair to global citizens and allowing outside people to flourish and reuniting families or whatever. Like all the past playbooks have not worked. So if we can frame it in this more, growth oriented national competitiveness, like, what Vivek was saying is, like, this is how we need to beat China and get some legislation passed and gets more visas issued, then but with the grace of God, go I.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong. And, even people have even tried, like, other different arguments that I don't necessarily agree with, like the 1 billion Americans and whatnot, right? The whole point of this debate is, like, how it has brought together a new form of coalition, I would say. Like, it reminds me of the kinds of coalitions you used to have during the Romney presidential cycle, or like before that even, actually, where Congress in America Competes Act, I believe, of 2007, when they were looking at some of the legal immigration changes, it was pro-business Republicans who understood the need here and who were making the push for this, supported by some Democrats. Because at the time, like, a lot of the Democrats really cared about, like, mostly they were focused on the undocumented illegal immigration side of things. And we kind of saw pendulum shift a bit during Chips and Science, where the Democrats were the ones pushing for legal immigration in there, and kind of, some Republicans blocking it. Now we're kind of back to the place where it's like, yeah, you have common sense minded lawmakers and influential people on both sides who really want to make the case. Like, when you look at even from the national security side of things, right? Like, during Chips and Science, about 6 or so former national security leaders signed a letter saying that this is critical for us to do and we need to do it right now. The China Select Committee held several hearings on the issue as well. So, you're starting to see, like, the national security community play a greater role in this issue, to your point about, like, how Lincoln phrased it as well. And I think that's mainly because people are starting to realize how critical these dual-use technologies on AI, semiconductors, biotechnology are going to be to beating China and beating any other emerging powers that may be, and to make sure that the United States maintains the lead for the foreseeable future.
It's interesting, Divyansh, because this isn't the first time that we've seen tech CEOs try to, like, spend money to get their way into this conversation. Mark Zuckerberg with Forward.us was a big push in the Obama era in particular. But it seemed that at that time there was much more energy around DACA related stuff than there was around high skilled immigration. Is that misreading the history?
No, I think you're right. I think one of the things that we're seeing that's a bit different right now is how much people are not just willing to raise the issue, but, like, go the full yardage. rather than just, stop at the 1 yard line and hope that you somehow get a QB sneak in, right? Well, you look at Elon, somebody who's gone through the process, somebody who really appreciates the need for high-skill legal immigration, saying that this is critical and I would not have Tesla and several other of my companies if it wasn't for this. But I will also go to fight for it if people try to take a step back, right? While recognizing that there are obvious issues that need to be fixed. I think a lot of the times previously you would see more of a H-1B is great. Keep H-1B or increase H-1B. We do not want to talk about the fraud that the IT consulting firms are doing or like the abuse that the IT consulting firms are doing. And we are also not particularly going to go the full yardage, right? Because there are a lot of priorities that people have, I think. But this time around, I feel like it's getting somewhat different, where this is becoming a priority. And that goes back to your question on salience. I feel like raising the salience of this issue makes it like a higher priority for people both who are opposing it and people who are supporting it. The other thing has been like humanizing it more so. Everybody in the country now knows Elon Musk, and humanizing the issue in that way where people know that high-skill immigration means Elon Musk is also a very different thing than saying high-skill immigration means computer science PhDs.
I think you're right. And I think also the sort of like lobbying and influence strategy is, downstream of these folks feeling spurned in the Biden administration or whatever, but like, you wouldn't have Elon buying a house in Mar-a-Lago. And this sort of goes back to your like, try to get it to the 1 yard line versus like doing the job yourself. I think the level of energy and engagement and willingness to get their hands dirty is very different from Mark Zuckerberg, hiring a few people and running some ad campaigns and hoping for the best.
That's also important. Like, I think like for from an advocacy standpoint, like you have to press all the levers, right? So I don't say that anybody's done anything wrong in particular. I feel like it's just we're getting to the right political moment and the right validators in that moment where it may actually make a difference. Like I normally, when people ask me like how much do I put as like a percentage chance of something happening on legal immigration, my baseline is usually about like 5% every Congress. And this time maybe I'm getting to like closer to 10, which isn't saying a lot, but it's still like the highest I've ever been.
There was like a darker timeline where Stephen Miller got to decide what American immigration policy was, and less from a regulatory side and more from an administrative side. And the fact that it is now clear that there are going to be loud counterweights, not totally fine with him pulling whatever shenanigans he wants to pull on sort of like approval process timelines or what have you, I think is an update.
Right. I think like one way to think of it is like, even if you don't get like affirmative policy changes, at least you won't have certain negative effects that we saw during the last administration. Like there was this policy that applications would be rejected or denied if any fields are left blank, right? Like, so you're applying for a visa or a green card, like, but you don't have a middle name, or like you don't have an address for a deceased parent, or you only have like 3 siblings named, but the form has space for 4. Like forms would be rejected. Forms were even rejected if you wrote NA instead of N/A, right? So like these kinds of small things that happened during the first term, there was this, a lot of kinds of small things that drove up H-1B denial rates as well. H-1B denial rates were about like 3% during the 5 years before Trump took office, and then went to 10% midway through the fiscal year 2020. And then denials for like new skilled worker visas also like quadrupled from about 7% to 29% during his administration. So at the very least, I think with this new coalition that you're seeing come in the new Trump administration, we're likely to not have those negative externalities come into effect.
Yeah, and just from atmospherics perspective, I mean, like the first news story was the Muslim ban, right? And that is very different from Trump ultimately weighing in on this, being asked in like a tuxedo on New Year's Eve or something, saying, I think immigration is great. I think we should do more.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. He also gave similar remarks in 2019, late 2019, actually, when he was talking about moving legislative package on skilled immigration. And then, obviously, we all know what happened come 2020 with the pandemic and everything. And he's referred to that multiple times. I think the president-elect he's intuitively been on this issue on the right side, like himself for a long, long time. Even Steve Bannon was like just talking, giving an interview about how President Trump during the first term, wanted to like increase the number of high-skilled immigrants, but his advisors had to talk him down that don't do it. Advisors meaning Bannon and Stephen Miller. And you look at like several of the books, that have come out from other appointees from his admin, whether it's H.R. McMaster or, several others who are talking about how high-skilled immigration is critical, who've written that in their books as well. And recently I was reading a couple of months ago, this article came out on China policy from Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher in foreign policy or foreign affairs, one of the two, where they were making the case like we need to increase high-skilled immigration like by reallocating green cards from the Chinese golden visa category, which is, their way of saying EB5, and reallocating 5,000 of those to EB1, which is reserved for PhDs and all. I think that would be great, right? Ideally, you increase the numbers overall, but even if you're not increasing the numbers overall, you have to look at which categories are more important for our critical industries and which categories are perhaps not so. If reshuffling is the only thing that's on the table, which is funny because like when Bernie Sanders was tweeting recently about like how H-1B is just a scam for the oligarchs to bring in like low-wage people to replace American workers, I was just thinking, I was like, first, his position has been that for decades, so nothing's changed. But at the same time, like, how do you square that with, if that's the argument you're going to make, then what's your argument for supporting something like the diversity visa, where no skills are evaluated at all, or the undocumented immigration on the southern border? Like, you have to really think through the politics of this, which I think some people are just not going to support it at all, no matter what happens.
Yeah.
And some people are going to be on the right side and trying to convince other people. And I think if you give in to the people who are never going to be supportive, who are never going to be convinced that some policy is good policy, then that's not an effective way of policymaking. Whereas, because they're not acting in good faith in that case. Whereas other people who are actually trying to come up with creative solutions to address an important problem, whether it's like reallocating green cards from EB5 to EB1s, or people like Musk, or like, I would work to remove the fraud in H-1B or the abuse in H-1B from IT consulting firms, but we have to increase the numbers of green cards. I think those are the solutions that creative solutions that we need to entertain and try to find a way which moves the country forward as a whole, rather than just listen to people who are never going to convince themselves of the other position.
So I want to talk a little bit about the culture wars side of this. We had Vivek tweeting something that got 100 million views. Our American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence for way too long. That doesn't start in college. It starts young. A culture that celebrates the prom queen over the math Olympiad champ will not produce the best engineers. A culture that venerates Corey from Boy Meets World or Zack and Slater over Screeched in Saved by the Bell will not produce the best engineers. We need more movies like Whiplash and fewer reruns of Friends. Do you buy this, Divyan?
I was watching the Steelers play the Chiefs on Christmas, you know? I feel like a system that rewarded, Travis Kelce to become a great tight end and Mike Tomlin to become a good head coach. You're not going to operate a society just based on engineers, right? I grew up in India, and yeah, you're either an engineer or a doctor or you're ashamed to your family, right? And so, which has its own issues, but I think that works maybe over there to some extent because you need more productive workforce, creating newer jobs and all. And I think there are things to improve in our STEM education system, absolutely, in the US and India and around the world. But I think there are other things that need to happen as well. Arts and culture are important. You need to, look, man, I used to write code for, I would come into, when I was doing my PhD, I would come to my PhD office 9 a.m. in the morning, and I would go home around 1 or 2 in the night. And I would come back again, I would do it again. And over the weekend, I would be like, okay, I'm not writing code anymore. I'm going to go watch a musical. I think that's great that we have that.
We'll get back to the interview with Divyansh in a second. But first, an anecdote on immigrant parenting.
So 2 very special guests here. My good friend Gauri Subramani and her high-skilled immigrant father, Professor Mani Subramani. Dad, let's have you kick it off. Yeah, how did your parents talk to you about education when you were growing up?
Of course, in India, we were not immigrants. I grew up in India. So in India, we all knew that education was really the route to having any kind of life. I mean, there were lots and lots of people subsisting on manual labor. And then there were people who were graduates, became judges, engineers, lawyers, doctors, and so on and so forth. The professional class was really the class that you wanted I guess every parent wanted their child to be in. So, interestingly, my father never went to college. So, my father actually completed high school, and then he became a radio officer in a ship, and then he became a radio officer on aircraft. Those days, they used to be radio officers. So, he had a professional certificate, and he didn't go to school. Nor did my mother. I mean, my mother finished school, but she didn't go to college. So college was a very aspirational goal in the family. So we all knew that we had to go to college. And so we were in schools, and we were in private schools because the public school system that really catered to the large mass was terrible, which was the free school system. So we went to private schools that prepared us to be professionals. And so this kind of a trajectory of education being the route to a good life was sort of given, at an early age. So if, for example, if I didn't have good grades, I mean, I had pretty decent grades much of the time. In fact, I was in the top of the class much of the time. But when I was not on the top of my class, my father would get really frustrated and say, look, what are you going to do with your life? I think you're going to be no good. And it's interesting. There was me and my brother, and both of us were pretty good academically, actually. And he was the healthier one, more outgoing. I was when I was young, I was weak. So he used to say, look, I think I'll have to buy you a taxi so that at least you'll have something to do when you grow up. And for my brother, it was even worse. And we lived in Calcutta where there was these human-pulled rickshaws. And so he used to tell him, well, you're actually going to be no good. So I'm going to have to buy you a rickshaw so that you will have a living. And we all knew that there were terrible lives to live. But it was some sort of I guess there was some love in this threat because he actually wanted the best for us. And so there was this tough love kind of thing. And so that was my background. And of course, we came to the US. I came to do my PhD. I had a engineering degree and I had a master's in management, and I came for a PhD in management to Boston University. And so, you're in this really smart place. And when I realized that the state was spending something like, those days it was $15,000 per pupil, which to me was a mind-boggling number. That there was public education that cost so much money. And so I really felt that every kid in public school had the responsibility to justify the kind of resources that were put into it. And I guess that is the way I saw what my daughters should be doing. I had two of them, and Vaishnavi and Gauri. We were talking to Gauri, who later has now become a professor. So I saw that it was really part of their duty to really justify the massive investment and trust the institution society was placing on them, spending this kind of money. To me, 15,000 was an unbelievably large number.
There's a sort of trope, or it's kind of a thing that Indian parents say to their kids, which is that they're lazy and useless. So, you sleep in on the weekend, you don't do something productive, and a pretty typical way that you're chastised is by being told that you're lazy and useless. And my parents used to say that to me. And I guess a lot of other Indian parents say that to their kids. And I remember once I saw a meme that was, catering towards Indian immigrant kids or South Asian immigrant kids that was making fun of this lazy and useless thing. And I showed it to my white Jewish American husband, and he was horrified. You have a child, you create a child, and then you tell the child that it is useless. Like, this is, it's wrong. And I had never thought about it that way. I just thought you're not doing anything useful, hence you are useless. So the next time we saw my parents, my husband brought this up sort of jokingly, and my dad said to him, "Oh, so your parents never called you lazy or useless?" A genuine question. And he said, "No, actually, my parents were pretty nice to us. They didn't say stuff like that to us." And without missing a beat, my dad said, "But you and your sister are so successful." So for him, there was no gap between berating your child and them being successful. Like, that was the causal link. So it was really surprising that my husband, who's professionally successful, his sister is a doctor, that they could have become that without being berated about their academics or their productivity by their parents.
Please reflect.
Yeah, and I must say that now that I hear Gauri say this, I feel sorry, but sadly, I now realize there was, I guess, quite some years ago, to us, giving the child some real reinforcement about, the positive direction was sort of important, I guess. So, for instance, I remember when Gauri was always really good. So she used to come back, and sometimes it would have an A on some paper, and it would say 95 out of 100. And the question was, where did the 5 points go? This is something you should be able to do. So it was some sort of an expectation that our kids would also do well and do well academically. And that's, to some extent, that was some sort of a narrow focus on academic achievement that actually drove us night and day. I can only say that it was very important to be in the PhD program, to do really well, because I saw people who got washed out of the program, so I had to survive, do well, so it was, to us, that seemed like the only path to success that we knew. And I guess I now see that as a narrow focus. We, of course, wanted our kids to be valedictorians. We wanted them to be the top of the class. Gladly, our kids did all of that. Gauri was the valedictorian. So it was sort of normal for all of this to happen. From our point of view, it was all just normal. And this is what we wanted for our kids.
Yeah.
So, but to some extent, I look back and say that I think we should recognize that though we did it and things turned out well, I recognize that may not always work for all kids. Thank goodness, if Gauri had been had a flair for the arts, it would have sort of been complicated for us to sort of think about how she would go forward and sort of support herself and do all of the things. Because for us, financial success was very important because we didn't have any backing of any kind. Because when I came to this country, we had about $200 and, whatever we could carry in 2 suitcases. And that's all that we had when we came here. So to us, there was no way to really, we didn't see any way of being able to be a financial support to them if they could not really make a success out of themselves from the word go, you realize. So I guess some of the parenting was fairly driven by some level of desperation that we feel for the next generation also to be successful.
Yeah, I think I also want to give the caveat that I was not sort of traumatized by this type of parenting. I think that it's definitely true that there are some personalities or people for whom it's worse to experience that. Perhaps if you're struggling at baseline, then getting that type of reinforcement can be very destructive. But it wasn't an issue for me. But I certainly did feel, like my dad mentioned, this need to be able to be financially self-sufficient while doing something that made my parents proud, and also thinking about the reality of being able to take care of them, which is maybe a greater cultural expectation than it is in the quote West. But that I should be not only self-sufficient, but thinking forward, I should be able to take care of them when they get older too. So that, I think, whatever ability to like explore without an orientation towards like optimizing was not as much something I felt like I could do.
Do you have any specific reflections on the Vivek post?
It resonated with me in that I think that the cultural tides maybe have shifted now such that the heroes or the protagonists in pop culture are not like the quote loser jocks, maybe the way that it was in the 90s. Also, by the way, like a lot of those pop culture references I didn't even get from the 90s because I was not allowed to watch those shows. So fitting with the kind of examples that he laid out. Yeah, I didn't watch any of those TV shows, but I'm aware vaguely of these like cultural figures. I remember also, even when I was in high school, which is maybe the most sort of like mainstream American context. I grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis, went to a great public school, so more diverse sort of in its student body as far as orientations towards all things. Some friends in high school who always felt like I was working too hard and too invested in school and too invested in trying to go to a good college. And I felt like that focus on optimizing for the future as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old was definitely like outside of the cultural norm.
Is this something that struck out to you about America when you moved here?
One thing I want to say is this general view that everybody gets a star for whatever is the level of achievement that they have. So I think it's very good to sort of nurture the ego when the child is young and all that. But I believe there are often situations where you need to give the kid real feedback. You're not shaping up. You got some things wrong. You have to get your concept straight out. So I somehow feel that a great concern for, not hurting a child is actually a disservice. And to some extent, I sort of see this. Yeah. One thing I would definitely also, this is just my feeling after coming here, is that there is not enough emphasis on the importance of STEM. Doing well in math and sciences is actually quite hard. And that ought to be celebrated more than it is.
How did you feel that in India growing up, and how do you sort of not see that in American culture?
Okay, a couple of things. I want to tell you one thing that just as a casual observation, it's very interesting to me that there were many women and others who say, oh, I can't do math. And they say it very easily. And they say it almost just a cultural trope. In India, we sort of believed that women were smarter than men and women can do better math than men. So it's a very different kind of thing. But in India, the kid who did well in math was the person to look up to, and everybody sort of knew who was the top of the class. And particularly in math and sciences. So these were all achievements that were celebrated. And of course, there was certainly sports in school, and there were people who were really good at sports, but there were all these academic prizes that were awarded at the end of each year. And so, I used to get a lot of these, the top scoring math kid, math and science and all of these, biology and chemistry. So you knew who was the top and you almost knew the hierarchy. Of course, it was a little cruel but we knew how we each performed. Grades were not secret. So there was a clear curve. In my engineering college, they used to just post the grades. So you go and say, oh, you got 90s, you got 91 and you got a B, and you could see who got an A and how much they scored. So to some extent, there was so much of a premium on pushing people to do well. And by the way, there's a small anecdote here. I remember someone telling me that if you got a kid off the street in the US and said, look, you can write a whole page on what you did over the Christmas holidays, or I can give you a page of math problems. Which one would you prefer? And most kids here would say, oh yeah, sure, I'll write a page. If you actually pose the same question in India, people say, oh yeah, sure, give me the math problem. Because in a sense, you knew what was the right answer. And that's sort of like it's always a challenge. Whereas the writing part was a little harder. So it's often the qualitative fields suffered a little more in terms of a lack of emphasis than the more quantitative fields, which are the STEM fields, programming and all of that.
Now, back to the regular interview.
Yeah, it is a weird framing because there is this reductio ad absurdum aspect to it, which is incredibly dark, right? Where, yes, if you are not a doctor or an engineer, you are a shame to your family and a shame to your nation. And I'm sorry, not everyone is going to be a doctor or an engineer. And they shouldn't spend their, society shouldn't force them to be, self-hating and miserable their whole lives. It just doesn't seem like,
And I probably shouldn't have to see a doctor who, did not study medicine for the love of it and barely graduated. We do need to encourage people to do more STEM education, to go more towards the STEM fields. That's important. A lot of how people put it, unproductive job categories, right? Reallocating the workforce from there to more productivity in more STEM fields. That's a good thing to do overall, I would say. But at the same time, you're not going to force everybody to become an engineer or a doctor. Otherwise, you're just going to have bad doctors and bad engineers.
Vivek goes on, the most normal parents look skeptically at those kinds of parents, i.e. Asian ones who push their children very hard in school to study STEM stuff. Most normal Americans views those kinds of kids with scorn. But if you grow up aspiring to normalcy, normalcy is what you will achieve. And normalcy doesn't cut it in a hyper-competitive global market for technical talent. And if we pretend like it does, we'll have our asses handed to us. I think he is kind of conflating some stuff here in that, yes, Divyansh, I totally agree with you and him in that there should be more movies and TV shows that make folks Oppenheimer and Einstein seem cool. And it would be really great if there were more viral videos giving some love to, math Olympiad winners and chess champions and whatnot. But I think there is something kind of dangerous about too much of that being top down driven. And once you get in a society like that, there are lots of other kind of darker downstream effects, which you see in the Chinese context. At the end of the day, you kind of gotta love it or like be passionate about what it is you do and study and work in if you really wanna excel. Like you could like trying to do a 180 in American culture, which does have this more like open-ended freeform approach to education, and trying to squeeze it down into something where you're, you know, hyper specializing at 13 and you have this like Gaokao style, like, you know, exam driven ecosystem. I think there are a lot of downsides in going down that.
I do also see Vivek's point. I'm not going to like completely dismiss it. And this is just like my personal view, not, you know, not anything attributed to anyone I may be associated with, any of my friends or my employer or anybody
or your parents, let's be clear.
Or my parents, right? Like I think there's a role for the government to play in here as well. I totally agree with Vivek on that. You look at whether it's like student loan programs. Should the government be providing greater opportunity in terms of like scholarships and loan programs for job fields that are more productive and lead to like above market wages versus programs where students graduate and don't find employment? I think that's a really important thing to consider from a policy perspective. And I think that's part of what Vivek is saying. The other thing that Vivek is also alluding to is, the lack of opportunity. Right? One of my friends, he's a physicist now, but like he grew up in the middle of Louisiana. He wouldn't have any opportunity to become a physicist normally unless it was for the LIGO lab that was, you know, in the area that gave him exposure to what kind of work physicists do,
Totally.
You know, encouraged him to go there. And I think like that's the kind of works, for instance, that the National Science Foundation has done a lot, has been continuing to do it. They call it the Missing Millions program, where a lot of American students would go into STEM fields if they had the opportunity, if they had the encouragement, and if they had the visibility. And I think,
do you know this Ronnie Chung riff where he's like the MAGA bros, like, I'd die for my country, but I wouldn't learn math for it?
hey, yeah, the number of hours I used to study math when I was a kid, like, yeah, that's, it wasn't just that you as a kid would just do your homework and be done and everything will be fine. No, you've got 3 extra textbooks that you have to go through. Your parents bought them for you. They're like, yeah, that's the textbook your school asked for. Here are 3 more textbooks that you're going to do because you're going to be a master at math. You're going to be a master in science, you know, physics, chemistry, and all those subjects. And then because of the competitive exams, both like for college entrance, even during high school and all, students would go the extra mile because they had the pressure to show for it. And that's not to say that the pressure is always good. I mean, I think a lot of people have mental health challenges that they don't necessarily talk about because it's a taboo in Asian countries, really, to talk about mental health. But, you know, I think people don't necessarily talk about like the other aspect of it, where, yes, you studied 4 math textbooks in a year, you studied 3 physics textbooks and whatnot, and you aced every exam, you did everything. Are you happy in life? Like, ask that question to the kids, like going to all these coaching classes for competitive entrance examinations in India, and you won't find a coherent answer.
My take is that, like, there are, you know, kids for whom it will work well, and there are kids for whom it will work. I mean, there's work well in an emotional health sense. There's work well in a sort of, you know, professional academic achievement sense. And my fear with the, you know, 愧疚管教育, like the, you know, criticize your kids and push them, like push your kids with the undercurrent of you are useless and you only will achieve if I berate you the whole time and you're falling behind and you're going to lose. Like that, I don't know how much more you're getting out of the kids that would have been fine in that mentality. And you are inevitably losing more kids than you can't not be turning off kids that would have, found some joy or interest in it in the other way. I mean, I think about like the Austrian and Hungarian Jewish mathematicians in the teens and 20s where like, yes, there was on the one hand, this like societal fear that like we're Jews and we're, on the outside and we have to be great. But by all accounts, those high schools were like the most like supportive, loving, friendly, like competitive in a healthy way atmospheres that ended up producing, God knows how many Nobel Prizes. So.
Yeah, man, I think competition's good. I think, I think pushing people to do better and to realize the potential that they have is good. You realize that particularly when you find yourselves like at a place like Carnegie Mellon where I went, where it was, I step in and I'm like, oh, these are like, everybody here is smarter than me. And so I need to up my game. That is really good at pushing both your own boundaries and becoming a better researcher, becoming a great mathematician, winning all those Nobels, Turing Awards, whatnot. But also it's good for humanity in the sense like only, a few of those people who are really pushing themselves to the next level are the ones coming up with all these like revolutionary cures and, for the diseases we haven't solved yet, or like coming up with the latest technologies and whatnot. So there's a balance to be struck here.
Yeah, sure. I guess my takeaway is like you shouldn't need to win a Fields Medal to feel like your parents love you.
Yeah, you're not Asian, dude. I am.
That's horrifying. I don't know. I guess you just get used to it. Like, how does it work? It's hard for me to imagine. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, exactly. I used to joke. I was like, when I defended my PhD, I was like, yeah, defended your PhD in computer science. Amazing. No tenure track offer? What a shame.
Oh, man. It's rough out there.
Exactly. No, I think it's interesting. This is a very interesting question on like, different methodologies of pushing people. I feel like my advisor was very supportive during my PhD, but also really, really, really pushed me to be really strong out there to do not just normal research, go the extra mile, do the extra work. And I think you see that in a lot of the PhD programs in particular. I do think like there are parts of the society where we have figured it out, like how to push people the right amount to realize their full potential. Obviously, like a lot of PhDs are still, they're depressed and anxious and whatnot. But still, there's a really good chunk of that population which is navigating it really well, where they're being pushed to get to the next level while having the support that they need. And I think like it's not a hopeless cause to arrive at that balance in every other aspect.
We have one more anecdote on tiger parenting before we change topics.
So there's a lot of issues with Vivek's tweet, clearly. Like, obviously, Whiplash is not meant to be an inspirational film. I'll mostly focus on this weird, and I say diseased, even valorization of tiger parenting. And it's weird because it's portrayed as this very Asian thing. Like, oh, Asian parents are tiger parents, they drive their kids super hard. And it's weird because in Asia, actually, a lot of people have expressed their opposition to tiger parenting, at least in China, which is what I'm most familiar with. So in China, in the past several years, there's been a lot of news coverage about the worst excesses of tiger parenting and the consequences it causes. Like, for example, you hear stories about this elementary school kid just jumped off a roof because of how their parents were treating them. And a few years back, a school called Hengshui Dongxue got quite well known because although they have very good test scores and they send a lot of kids to Peking University and Tsinghua every year, they had this just absolutely oppressive educational regime that drives their kids to the absolute brink, to the point that they had to install suicide nets in order to prevent their students from constantly just jumping off of buildings, I guess. And so things like this elicit a lot of controversy in China, obviously, and a lot of people express their disgust with this really toxic form of child rearing. And so even if tiger parenting remains a thing in China, both because of tradition and also because it's just everything is so competitive, a lot of people have issues with it and they want to see something better take place. And so I think it's weird here in the US where some Asian Americans, not all, but some Asian Americans have taken tiger parenting to be an essential part of their identity. But it overall reveals this really essentialized attitude towards Asian parenting, which is equated with tiger parenting, and people see as like this immutable thing you can never change. And that's obviously wrong because, first of all, not all Asian parents are tiger parents. And second of all, like people in Asia want to change this. So clearly it can be changed.
All right, 2 more questions to close with. Where else do you think like the hardcore MAGA voices are going to want to have a say when it comes to tech policy in general and AI in particular?
I think in AI, we've seen like a lot of focus on free speech and censorship from people on the right. And I think it's an important focus to have, especially, Vice President-elect has spoken about it a lot on how open source is critical because we can't let big tech censor conservative voices. And, reasonable people can disagree or agree, whatever, on like how much of that is a real concern versus not. But I think having a focus, I think like the tech right, the MAGA folks, obviously, like you're going to see a lot of focus on free speech, censorship, and whatnot. And I think that's a good focus to have. We're certainly not an authoritarian regime that just like does not respond to queries about Tiananmen Square or like just responds very favorably about the Uyghur genocide. So that's one of the areas where we are going to see people focus a lot. I think some of the aspects of the Biden administration's executive order on bias and discrimination, I feel like those are probably out the door because MAGA folk certainly don't like that. And I think reasonable people can have a reasonable argument about like whether existing laws already cover that or not, and whether you needed things in the executive order to have around those issues. Maybe some aspects of government overreach overall, right? I think some people will make an argument that, hey, certain kinds of notification reporting requirements, etc., are government overreach, and we should not have that. And that will be a spirited debate, I assume. There will certainly be a lot of focus on how you integrate AI in government services to not just from removing waste, fraud, and abuse perspective, but like just generally, how do you integrate AI in defense, in the intelligence community, and do so more rapidly? So I feel like those are some of the areas where we're going to see a big prioritization on the right.
Sure. My take is like the big one hasn't come yet, but if and when AI really starts to matter and starts changing people's jobs and taking jobs away, quote unquote, like that's when the sort of like Laura Loomer, what are these H-1B immigrants doing here taking away American jobs energy is going to come back in a much more virulent strain.
We kind of saw that during this debate too, right? Like where people were talking about how companies were laying off certain workers while still hiring H-1Bs, not really talking about like the differences in the jobs, right? Like they weren't mentioning that the company a company may have to lay off like say 4,000 accountants, but want 2,000 more research engineers.
Sure.
So like some reallocation of the kinds of jobs that companies will be looking for potentially going to happen. And that will lead to some more of this debate, I guess. Maybe not so in a more, not really in a factual manner, but yeah, we'll see. I think the other thing you see already happen, to your point about AI taking or like AI coming in, jobs becoming an issue. I think like look at the longshoremen union, just like opposing automation of ports writ large, right? Because why? Preserving jobs for dock workers, even though automated ports are more efficient, cheaper, and provide goods in a faster, more efficient manner, goods that will be cheaper for the American consumer, especially when we are in a high inflation era. I think we're already kind of seeing that debate play out, and it's not really going well for automation.
Another angle which like bubbled up a little bit and may start bubbling up a little more is like the China, or outsourcing in general, I think. And then just like China connections in particular. There was some tweet it was Laura Loomer, which basically like ran through the sort of, the rap sheet on Elon from not giving Starlink to Taiwan to building a Tesla Gigafactory in Shanghai and what have you. Here's Laura Loomer. We all knew you only donated your money so you could influence immigration policy and protect your buddy Xi Jinping. What else do we get?
I don't even know how to relate the two. Like, was there an Oxford comma in there?
No. He didn't win because of tech billionaires like you who want to buy influence to jeopardize our national security by selling out to China and replacing American workers with foreigners who have disdain for white Americans. Oh, there we go with the kicker. She also called him a pawn of China at some point. And I don't think this is the first time we're going to see the Elon-China connection salience be brought up. And the fact that it came from the MAGA right as opposed to anywhere else was a new development for me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it was also brought up after Elon's opposition to the CR, right? Because the original CR was going to include ban on outbound investment in China on around AI, semiconductors, and whatnot. And that CR got killed. Then you saw a very clean CR without outbound, without the outbound provisions in there. And so I think we're already kind of seeing that, not just from MAGA, but also like you see that from a lot of China hawks, right? Where what's going to happen? And it's important to know, right? Like not only the Gigafactory in Shanghai, Tesla doesn't have FSD approval in China right now. Right? So you kind of need that, I guess, for your cars to be competitive. But maybe I'm misreading something there. So that's an interesting dynamic that certainly one to watch out for, especially with the whole tariffs conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, you see, he's been talking about a lot of countries lately, right? England, Germany, whatnot. Hasn't said a word about China.
I mean, he never has, really. I mean, the thing, when he's talked about China in the past, he's basically said lines that you'd hear out of Chinese officials when it comes to Taiwan in particular. And look, he's smart. He knows he shouldn't be tweeting about that.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of, actually? You remember that Senate Homeland Security hearing where the Intel executive was asked by Josh Hawley whether he would condemn the genocide of Uyghurs, and he was like, I'm not qualified to comment.
What was great also was like Laura Loomer started tweeting out like, hey, David Sask and Elon, could you like condemn the fact that like China has hacked into like every single cell phone that exists in America? That was another one that got 10,000 likes. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that'll be a dynamic to watch.
For sure. On the FSD thing in China, it is really interesting to what extent like AI approval is going to be a non-tariff barrier, which at this point it's only really Apple and Tesla for matters, right? But like, what Apple Intelligence is going to end up looking like, and what autonomous driving is going to look like for Tesla cars is going to be increasingly important for those firms keeping their market share in China.
Yeah, I think like that's certainly going to be critical for their competitiveness. You're kind of seeing that play out in Europe already, right? Like certain functionalities on the iPhone or like even ChatGPT functions like Sora are not available in the EU because of EU's laws. And so I think a lot of countries will have to start thinking about like how do they go about these new technologies, whether they want to keep their consumers just blocked off in a cave or like are they going to enter the world again?
All right, final question, Divyansh. Why haven't I heard of any AI labs based in India?
That's a really good question. You look at India's R&D expenditure, it's less than 1% of GDP. That's one of the biggest reasons why, right? There's no shortage of talent. In fact, like there's a lot of talent. A lot of that talent excels when it leaves India. Because R&D is not really been a priority for investment from the government perspective. And I have my suspicions why. I guess like there are priorities, there are things that buy you votes and things that don't. But if they really want to think of AI lab, if they want to have next generation models, but be built in India or like commercial applications be built in India, I think the government will have to rethink its stance on R&D policy. They can't just get away with, investing 0.6% of the GDP every year in R&D. That's not enough, especially for a country with the talent pool of that size. And second, I would say is, the startup ecosystem needs to get better. There are regulatory barriers that the government needs to focus on providing more clarity and certainty, more deregulatory actions around certain technology areas that need to happen for all of this to come to fruition. I think they're making some plays with regards to manufacturing, but that's a very different skill set and a very different kind of capital investment than the kind of capital investment that you would need for like training a large AI model or having, that is required essentially. If you want to, if you're a large AI lab, or then that's your product. And that requires you building data centers, getting a lot of compute. And in fact, like I was watching Jake Sullivan's speech this morning. He was speaking to IIT Delhi students about the collaboration between US and India on AI, semiconductors, and whatnot. And one thing he mentioned during that was the issue of like how US and India need to work together to promote responsible diffusion of AI around the world. And that means making sure that chips and hardware, semiconductors that are meant to not end up in certain jurisdictions do not end up in those jurisdictions, right? Like you look, a lot of chips exported to India end up in Russia for some reason. And it's not like the big labs or big companies that are perpetrators of this. It's like smaller companies, and then they get, fined by BIS and a whole lot of other things happen. But like to build a greater ecosystem where there's more trust in investing in India in terms of advanced GPUs being sold to India and whatnot, I think that is, you need to have a whole ecosystem around it. You need to have export controls, you need to have R&D policy, you need to have startup policy. So there's like a whole aspect that the government needs to focus on. Right now, they're very focused on manufacturing, and many of the manufacturing initiatives have started to show clear results. I think next up, they need to start thinking about this area.
Yeah.